of the best ways to help yourself is to help another person.
Yes. Yeah, and it's hard, especially when you need help in the moment, but without a doubt, placing your trust in others and also placing whatever experience that you need help from, using that as a tool to help someone else, I feel like is the best thing. Because a lot of people that are, I mean, look at Robin Williams, a lot of people that are sad or going through something are usually the kindest giving people, you know?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it boils back into that bigger message of purpose. When you find purpose, usually in other people, that's when, you know, your life is a little bit more livable. Even with, like, when a parent has a child, your purpose becomes to take care of that child. You place your life's mission in something larger than you, you know?
Yes.
And I think when we talk about isolation too, that's what those people that are isolated don't have yet. And I've been able to find that through my art.
Yes. Nicola, LeDonne, thank you for coming today.
Thank you for
an interview. For author of From Hanging to Hang On. Declare Fine Art is pleased to be interviewing you in collaboration with the Art Gallery. How was your childhood and your life in general affected by, as you were saying, talking about depression and suicide? Can you give us a bit of the backstory?
Yeah, 100%. And it's interesting too, because all my childhood, it was fairly happy. Like, my childhood was like Disney movies, Peter Pan, Beauty and the Beast, Lion King, and to think about, like, this is an image that I left with is almost the complete opposite. Like, I never would have said, like, as a third grade me, I'm gonna make films on depression, you know? So I think leaving with that very happy, you know, all dreams come true and, like, the good guy always wins philosophy kind of helped push me down into an area of suicide and depression, because I left with this philosophy that life is wonderful and magical and perfect, and where, yes, you can find that, it's not always the reality. So I think that bubble popped in college. With me, for depression and suicide, I've always had small rumblings of depression since high school, which a lot of people do. And then because suicide was always in the back of my mind, I kind of related that to self-doubt as, like, I'll never get anywhere, you know, maybe life isn't worth living. But there was always a goal to kind of move me forward. And then in college is when it fell apart. And in college I was studying animation, I was trying to make things work. I had issues of bullying, harassment, and at the same time I was trying to come out as gay. And suicide comes from this trapped feeling. So I had this generally negative life. I didn't feel like I was supported, and I started to build this trapped feeling. And it escalated when I was trying to come out. You know, as you do when you're gay, you try to hide from others. So without a lot of support in my college, I ended up just being horrifically depressed, went out for the first person I could find, and ended up being sexually assaulted. Being this Disney person that believes in happiness, to fall into assault is where everything kind of came in. And specifically on trauma, like, I remember, like, my head tilted to the left and his head was pressing it down, and I always share the story because that moment has kept with me. So occasionally if I think about that, or if I'm returned about it, you know, even with my art, the image of this boy in my film, he's holding his head the same way that I held it, and he's looking, as far as the angle, to the left the same way I did. So years later, I started to develop PTSD, where I remembered the assault, and I remember the feelings on my body where I would just turn and feel like it's happening again. And in college, I didn't know why that was happening, how to deal with it, and then I eventually nearly committed suicide by hanging. And after that, I was so lonely in my youth, I wanted to make a film that would show someone where I went, and then also how to come back out, and that's where the idea From Hanging to Hang On came. And really, like, from today, I've conquered a lot of these issues I've had in the past, from depression, suicide, loss, PTSD, trauma. Like, I call myself the happiest person to talk about depression because I can. And I think that ability now to look at the issues that I had and see it as, it's you know, there's a reason to the pain and why my mind went through these certain avenues as far as PTSD to process. And that's been what my art has been, is trying to explain the lessons that I had to go through myself to a younger generation that hopefully won't have to go through those lessons.
How impactful do you feel this whole pandemic has been to mental health?
Oh, it's been devastating. Because the worst thing about, I mean, there's just so many factors that lean into it. When you talk about the isolation, when you talk about the crush of the economy, when you talk about the fear of the future. So there's so many different avenues where people have had their lives saying in a straight path, and all of a sudden it's just thrown out the window. And I think the biggest issue is isolation, because from there your mind spikes more. So everyone can talk about the loss of a job, a loss of income, a loss of profits for a small business, and all that kind of stuff. But the bigger worry is that when you're isolated within yourself, you start to cycle into worse areas. So where maybe you had just lost your job, when you're isolated and can't find one, it's not that you've lost your job, it's I'll never find a job. Or if maybe you're in a relationship and there's more domestic violence now because you're stuck together, that amplifies it as well. And then when you're isolated, it's like, well, this is the person that loved me and now I'm alone. It's that growing feeling of loneliness that then can kind of cause your mind to spike into more areas. And I just feel like it's been devastating for a lot of people too, because they cannot accept what is a new reality. So a lot of people like to, avoid negative feelings thinking that it will go away. Yep. And this is something that you cannot avoid no matter what you do. And a lot of people that specifically like control and that are specifically maybe are successful can't handle this situation because they were basically demanded to take a lifestyle change. And that in and of themselves is the bigger, worry for a lot of people that they cannot deal with, where I feel like almost lower income people can handle this better because they're used to the hardship, where people that were fine financially and are just thrown into the fire right now are completely new to it and just devastated. That I kind of link it to. It's a negative feeling, a trapped life, and then no support. So no support could be that you don't maybe have parents that you could talk to, you don't have friends, but it could also just be the isolation. Like support comes in multiple factors. But as long as you have those three items, a negative life, trapped feeling, and no support, that's the recipe for suicide. Because a lot of times too with prevention, they'll give these long lists of everything that you could ever feel. Like, he pulled away from a event, or he's crying, or he's talking sad. Right. But it becomes such a long list that you don't know what to look for. Yes. So I feel like if you keep it simple as those three topics, you can kind of spot people that may fall into depression and suicide.
When I first mentioned the Club 27 project to you about doing an event at the Alpha Voyage Gallery to raise awareness around depression and suicide, you really felt that this was very important. How important is it to do events like this?
Well, it's everything, because when you think about suicide in particular, suicide is stopped by conversation. It's the simplest thing. It doesn't cost money. It's, I felt suicidal. If you do too, you're not alone. That's as simple as, the suicide prevention game is. And with so many people, they're scared to talk about it. And as a suicide prevention speaker too, for the past, 5 years, I'll go to high schools, colleges, a lot of different things with more of the normal public, and they're so frightened. Like I once was at a convention and the opening speaker talked about suicide. And I call myself the happiest person to talk about depression. Like outside of this, I was working at Nickelodeon with Blue's Clues and all this stuff that you would never relate to suicide. But this guy opens the convention and he goes, suicide. And it's like the scariest conversation I've ever heard in my life. And that fear of just simply having the conversation and putting on an event and talking about it in public halts all the progress you can do in saving a life. So the more we could do to talk bluntly about it is good, because on the same note, some people may hold an event on suicide prevention and they'll simply say, stop suicide. I'm like, well, that's wonderful, but you're not really explaining the complex nature of my mind, what a suicide attempt feels like, and then how to find help. Because that's the bigger thing, is that everyone knows that you shouldn't commit suicide. Hell, when I was about to hang myself, I knew that I shouldn't commit suicide. And I think talking more about how we specifically fall into it, what a suicidal escalation feels like, from the viewpoint of attempt survivors is better, because that way people that are coming close can specifically see, oh, I've thought about this pattern of suicidal thoughts in this one specific way, as far as like an urge. So a suicidal urge, you could be on top of a building and all of a sudden your body will jolt forward, and that could lead to an attempt. So that's what you want people to recognize within themselves to find help. And you don't know those things without talking about it. But that's the issue, is that a lot of people do not want to talk about it, or they talk about it so generically that no one can see themselves in it, if that makes sense.
Is that jolting forward, is that basically that there's something in the person's unconscious that is...
Possibly. I'll tell you this much. I'm a cartoonist, not a psychiatrist. That's the way I kind of take all my talks. But when I was, for instance, I remember there was once in my life I thought about cutting myself, right? And I passed out from needles and blood. So it's something I would never want to do. But I remember I once had a knife here. And me attempting suicide by cutting would be this. And it's one of those things where I will sit here and I might be here for 20 minutes and I'm waiting for that one urge where I get the nerve to do it and I go, And that's what it is. It's about fighting that same urge. Or same thing if I see a car. So maybe, and I had this moment too, where I was walking in college trying to get away from people. I saw a car and I just wanted to move in front of it. But it's that jumping urge. And I think that's what I have felt from my own personal experience. And I think universally for people that have successfully attempted suicide and passed away, I feel like it's something where it was someone fighting for maybe 10-15 minutes not to do it, and they felt that second urge, and that's where it comes from.
Nice.
So by talking specifically about moments like that, people can see that within themselves and see, understand that it's almost like an accidental fall. And that's what I consider, even with jumping. If you're on a ledge, it takes a second to fall off. And I feel like that's the moment that you're trying to avoid. But when you just say generically, stop suicide or suicide, you don't understand those complexities. The same thing like suicidal ideation will build where, in high school I was depressed. And I was fine in high school. I had a great family life. I was an overall happy person, but I would just have this occasional sad thought, I'm not going to be happy in life.
Right.
Or I shouldn't be here. Or I don't have a lot of friends. And it would slowly build up year after year. So the first day I said it, maybe say freshman year in high school, it was just sad, whatever it is. But after 4 years of senior year in high school, I would look back and say, I've been thinking this for 4 years. These small thoughts that might come every 3 months.
So they build up.
They build up, and it becomes your own reason why, a trail of evidence to why I keep saying I should do it, maybe I should.
Right.
And it keeps building you get to a point where maybe 6 years later, which was my hanging attempt, where I say, I have been saying this for 6 years. I should finally do it. And that's so common with everyone that has suicidal thoughts. It's a long trail and then it just explodes when you feel too trapped. And we don't, when we talk about that, people can see that in their own lives and understand, oh, that's what I'm feeling, I shouldn't do it. And that's why I say hang on. And that's where it is. Just the more that we talk about those specifics, the more we can get, especially young people, to recognize these signs within themselves.
Yes.
Because we talk so much about suicide prevention as, if you were I was suicidal, let's just talk about it that way.
Right.
You would have to find signs in me and then try to convince me to get help.
Yes.
So we all have it based on prevention externally. I feel that we should have someone like me in our youth recognize the signs in myself. That way I can come to the acceptance that I am depressed, I am becoming suicidal, and I find help. Because you trying to spot these signs in someone else is so difficult.
Yeah.
The best thing we can do is make sure that people realize it in themselves, accept it, and then find help. And that also makes, it's also a bigger lesson in that, to make sure that talking about depression is okay. So the fact that you could see someone like me who's, I've animated on Blue's Clues. That is the happiest thing you could think about. My full-time job was basically go bow, 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 bow. There was a day where I ate a birthday cake as blue, I was magenta, I was a salt shaker. But then I had a bad past. And I think for someone else to see, look, you could be in a dark spot, you can openly say I was depressed or suicidal, but it doesn't define the rest of your life.
Yes.
And I think that just key issue is huge for people, just to see a life after suicide.
I think in art history in general, there is a lot of suicide.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And even I think, for me, I felt isolated from depression, not have a lot of friends. And I had a few friends, but my depression pushed me farther away. And specifically because I was isolated, I had time. And the time allowed me to pursue art, because art is a very demanding field as well, especially animation.
Yes.
So I feel especially for people of high success in any field, when their depression or suicide isolates them, isolation presents a track to do work. And that presents a track to, find success, create new art, create films. But that doesn't change the core, issue of depression or whatever it is in your life.
Right.
That isolation is just time. And then it's what do I do with this time?
The isolation factor, if I look at Club 27, we look at Amy Winehouse or Kurt Cobain, Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, there seems to be a definitive pattern that just before they were about to do whatever they did self-isolate.
Yeah.
Do you feel that there is a tremendous amount of isolation in this modern society now?
Yeah, I think there is, and there's a lot of different patterns from that. And even with me, before my attempt, I just pushed away from everyone. And it's one of those things, too, where I had people in my life that would have helped me, but I avoided accepting the help, too. So that's definitely a big key, that you want to, take yourself out of life before you officially do it. And then within isolation for society, it's weird with social media too, we live in a connected society that is very isolated.
Yeah.
So because if you take social media, if you're, say, alone in quarantine, right? But you're looking online and maybe a friend or other friends are with, going out drinking or working a job or doing something social. Social media will give you this glorified image of everyone being happy.
Yes.
And that spikes your isolation, even though you're connected with people virtually. And then even with our society too, I feel there's almost a stigma on isolation. So if you are isolated, you make yourself feel that you are unhappy. Like, one of the worst things supposedly you can do as a person is go to the movie theater by yourself.
Yeah.
But you watch a movie by yourself.
Right.
Like, everyone is isolated in the movie theater, but if you had to go through that experience, you feel like, oh, my life sucks. Right. So there's also a stigma that if you are isolated, you should feel more depressed because you are, without friends or you don't do enough. But yeah, I mean, we are in general an isolated society, and then we're a society that also shames people for being isolated.
Yes. Is there a particular character in Club 27 that you identify with, or that you like their work, or their music, or their art?
I think Amy Winehouse specifically, like, her art is so soulful and unique, you know what I mean? Especially, like, with her memorial, like, I remember, Bruno Mars did, like, a cover, I forget the song, but her work is just so soulful, where you think of a life that's in trauma, but then it's kind of like me with art that visualizes hope. So I kind of like that truthfulness, you know what I mean?
Yes.
Valerie, that was the song.
Oh yeah, that's a beautiful song.
Yeah.
I remember when she did her duet with Tony Bennett. Tony Bennett said after the camera that he could see that she was tremendously suffering.
Yeah.
But when she started to sing, it all went away.
And that's funny too, because on that, it kind of goes into isolation, because when you're with a group, you feel better. But then it's when you go back by yourself. Like, if you're in your passion singing, you feel great. But then when you go back at night and you're about to sleep, that's where the depression and the suicide spikes as well, because it's like when you're alone, forced with your thoughts, that's where the fear comes in, you know what I mean? And it also builds on that with a lot of celebrities. When you achieve that level of fame, you feel almost guilty for feeling sad. And especially with seeking help, because people won't understand if you have everything.
Yes.
You have this amazing career, why would you be sad? And people would say, well, look what little I have and how much you have, you shouldn't feel bad because I don't feel bad, or something like that.
Right.
So it becomes a complex layer where people in poverty, are suffering with depression, but then people at the highest level of, fame have that same, feeling of sadness that they won't allow themselves to feel.
Very interesting. So it doesn't necessarily correlate with financial freedom that you're going to be.
Oh, it means nothing. Yeah, because you got to think too. It's like, if you think of like the lowest income area of the country, people still smile. If you think about third world countries, people still smile. Like, I always say, happiness is free. That expectation that fame, success, money, or buying the Gucci, flip-flops is going to bring you a different emotional state is just not true. And I think it's about the experience of your life. It's about the people that you share it with, what you share with yourself as far as your passions. I think that's what brings happiness, not something that you would pay with a price tag.
How did you get into fine art illustration?
Well, I think for me, it's always been a journey to express myself, right? So my biggest piece is hanging that deals with suicide, and having that come from my own experience with loss, suicide, different forms of trauma. Art for me has been my way to visualize that trauma. So where it's, especially within culture, it's hard to talk about these issues, I felt it's more impactful to use my art as a statement to connect to people. As well with like my film, it's screened in about 30 different countries, so for places I can't even talk to because I don't know the language, art has been an ability to communicate to those people without words. So I feel like that universal language of trauma, of family, and those values can be expressed through art, which you can't do with anything else.
It seems to me that in your work as an animator and as a writer, that you have your own language that people seem to really relate to.
Yeah.
Do you think that is because you are somebody who has been through a lot in life, or this is just something that's endemic to you as a person?
No, I think as wonderful as that sounds, this is just me as a person. I think it's exactly what you said as far as being true. So I think a lot of what I speak on is just pure honesty. Like, it doesn't sound great that I say I attempted suicide, and it doesn't sound great that I was sad. You know what I mean? Like, a lot of people look at that and be like, he's a bum or he's a wimp. And I think my honesty to address those issues and to kind of talk about my failures hoping that it gives others strength, is what connects to so many people. Because I don't, like, we've talked about it before, like, I'm not very mute about it.
Yes.
I'm very direct, I'm very open, and even though it's not the best things to talk about as far as, like, it's not always wonderful to talk about assault. Like, it's not something easy, especially being a man, to say that it happened. But even though I regret that it happened, I accepted that it did happen and said, if I went through that, I'm going to make sure that I can help someone else not fall into the same kind of nightmare that I did.
Right.
And I think that honest viewpoint, outside of the art, but that ability to speak honestly is what connects to people. And I think because the messages are so simple, like I talk about the love for a mother to her son, or the loss of a dad, or, you know, just finding love in a relationship. And I think those themes are so simple that anyone in the world can relate to them.
So that hope that you have, how do you cultivate that in yourself?
What do you mean?
Because you have, regardless of what has happened to you, regardless of your experiences, you still remain very hopeful.
I know, it's weird.
It's beautiful.
I shouldn't be that hopeful. I should be like this sad sack of potatoes somewhere.
No, it's like I want some of it.
I know, right?
Right?
It's contagious, which is a great quality. I think for me, because I've seen so much pain, that I've wanted to validate the reasons to my sadness. So a lot of people say, like, life sucks, which is, we were talking about Island. Like, I've been sad for 60 years, it hasn't changed.
Right.
Now, I did not want to say life sucks. I wanted to say I was brought down for this specific reason to help someone else. And that's been my core. Like, when I was making Hanging, I thought specifically about a younger version of myself. Like the same third grader that was getting tucked in under the covers by his mom that would grow up to be suicidal. I knew somewhere else out there was a kid like me that was going to fall into suicide.
Right.
When I was making the film, there was a part of me that was going to take Hanging and just throw it out. I wasn't going to finish it. And what pushed me forward was thinking, if I don't make this film, if I don't tell a story, I'm going to let that younger version of myself down, and I basically have this kid's life in my hands. And that's kind of what has pushed me and given me hope, is that I'm trying to make art that talks to the younger version of myself to save them in the way that I wasn't saved myself.
Yes.
So I think that I left the pain behind. I used to be motivated by pain, and now I'm motivated by the lives that I could save. And I think that mindset change is what has really driven my hope. You know what I mean? Because I'm not propelled by the pain and the anger and the people.
Right.
I'm motivated by those lives that I can help.
You'd shared with me what stopped you from committing suicide.
Yeah.
Can you share with us?
Yeah, 100%. So when I was up in that moment, what I tell people about a suicide attempt is that all positive memories will fade, and it's like an escalation. So my life felt completely negative, and every negative in my life was amplified. And I got up to the moment I was by my closet door. I had a belt wrapped around the end and then wrapped around my neck, and I was standing on a laundry basket, and I was about to jump. And I had this memory of my mom. And for a lot of people, you know, a loved one is a reason to keep going forward, but it wasn't her like telling me to stop or saying I love you or anything like that. It was simply her singing a lullaby from when I was a kid. And I remember when I was like, you know, third grade, loved Disney movies, this bubbly little boy, I would always be tucked in to sleep by my mom, and she would like brush my hair back, and she would just lull me to sleep every night. And that song started to play in my head, and the thought of what my death would do to my mom was bigger than my initial core value, you know, want to die. And in the moment I still wanted to, but the guilt delayed me. And from there, I slowly started to pick up my pieces. And it was interesting, when I started to make my film, the second I started to make it, my father passed away.
Yes, you shared that with me.
Yeah, so you talk about the core support of your life, you know, your parents. And I started this journey on filmmaking losing basically almost everything. As my family fell into chaos, my mom also started to fall into her own moments of depression. And it comes onto that bigger theme where depression is something we don't talk about it. And my mom knew during this horrific time period for our family that I was making this animated film where this son was saved by this mom. And I usually say, all of our life is about the people that pull us forward. And when you watch this mother is tearing at this fog and trying to get to her son, and there's nothing she wouldn't do to save the son. So when my mom was having her own hard times through my dad's death, my film kind of gave her strength to keep going. You know, we never talk about these issues, but just because I was able to visualize it through her art, she saw how important she was to me and that I loved her. And that common aspect of saying I love you kind of helped her get through her own darkness.
How important has your art been to you personally? in allowing you to explore. Obviously, you've done this amazing short film, and you've also written a book about it.
Yeah.
How do you feel the medium of your work has allowed people to relate more to this issue of suicide and depression?
Yeah, I think it's just something where it really hits you, like especially like mixing art and film with hanging like the sound design really just smashes into the audience, where a lot of people that I've showed the film to at film festivals or screenings for colleges or high schools, they've never maybe had depression or suicide themselves, but feeling the impact of my film and like the trauma from the speakers and like the pain on the character's face, that kind of puts them into the moment of a suicide attempt where they can actually feel what happened. So it's that interactive experience that they get to walk through. And then for me, it's also become a bit of purpose, you know what I mean? Like where I can't change my past, but I can choose how I react to it. So I usually say that my animated films are a reflection of my trauma, and then the murals and other paintings I do is a reflection of my inner hope. So I feel like people are able to see both of those sides, where they see these dark and gritty films that represent a bad time, but then they see these very colorful and vibrant murals that reflect the positivity in life and the aftermath, you know?
What's next for Nicola LeDonne?
Well, I have my book that's turning out into an audiobook soon. I'm talking with a couple different mural projects locally in the area, but I have Hanging Dear Dad as a secondary film, and I'm working on a third film called Reaching Out. And Reaching Out documents my own experience coming out and healing from abuse and finding love. And once that film is out too, I would have taken all the 3 worst moments of my life and created a positive statement through art for others. So that's my core focus right now is finalizing a new mural and then finishing my final film.
When you're designing a mural, do you do it instinctively, or do you draw it out before you jump in?
I usually am much more instinctual because, especially for me, it's an energy. Like, there's a line in my book at the end where I say, I've always had this feeling of falling off a mountain as far as visualizing my depression, like trying to get somewhere and falling off. And at the end of the book, I have a line where I say, I yelled higher than the mountaintops to the height of my hopes. And that's kind of my philosophy with murals, is that every time I've painted one, I've been down in some way in my life, and the mural has been my way to kind of yell through my art, you know what I mean? And kind of yell for someone else to hear through it. And I think of it like a silent yell too, because no one ever hears the actual voice, but they feel it, you know what I mean?
Well, Nicola LeDonne, author of From Hanging to Hang On and fine art graphic illustrator, thank you very much for your time and coming in. For me, Philip DeClaire with DeClaire Fine Art, and thanks to Jeffrey at the Alpha Voyage Gallery, and I look forward to great things from you.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure talking and speaking.